What's the biggest misconception people have about how that transition went? I feel like there's a lot of mythology and a lot of, people talking out of their, what about it. But what you were there, what do people not understand about how it was?
I think that basically the one thing that for me, the real wake up call to like how tricky this all is that the handoff from each of these phases is very difficult, right? You think you're building this system and everything's going to happen and then it's all going to play out the way you want. But the most important handoff is on January 20th, right? When he stands in front of the Capitol, puts his hand on the Bible. At that point, the whole transition office essentially evaporates, and everybody goes into their jobs in whatever department they're working at, in the White House or in the DHS or whatever. And now they're trying to figure out how they get their desk and they get their badge and they're doing all these things that are very pedestrian, sort of like, they're not doing the stuff that you put in all these memos. And so I think that's the piece of this that really needs to be managed effectively, that you need to make sure that the people who are running different pieces of the transition are the people who are going to be actually executing that in the administration. Otherwise, the handoff won't work. One of the pieces for me, I was on the personnel side, and it was, but when Trump was sworn in, he selected as his personnel person a guy named John DeStefano, who hadn't really been working on personnel at all. Like he wasn't on the team at all. And, that basically, so he's starting from square one, right? I mean, I think he still presumably had some of the documents that we had been working on, and certainly the cabinet designees had that, but it was, that was a little bit of a challenge. And so that I think those are pieces that I think need to be really, you got to pay attention to those pieces.
Within the conservative movement, I mean, I think, well-intentioned people who thought they were fighting, who, and had been fighting, even they had a lot of issues with the president. I mean, what was it like to be in rooms where, people who had exhibited courage, who had gone out on a limb in the past, but just were completely revolted by the direction that Trump wanted to take things? Like, what was that like? I mean, I've heard stories, I've read books about all of the friendships that were broken, et cetera, but curious what you make of that piece of it.
Well, I think that is going to naturally exist. One of the, I worked for the Center for New Hampshire for 10 years and actually lived there for a while. Basically, New Hampshire goes through this every 4 years, right? More so Iowa, New Hampshire in particular, and to some extent South Carolina, the political party basically gets into a fight to the death every 4 years, and then at the end of it, you have to sort of put the pieces back together. It's the nature of a robust presidential primary that you're going to have people on either side, different candidates who basically believe that their vision is what needs to happen, but then at the end of the day, somebody wins, right? And so I think that was really what ultimately was some people struggled with after the after the election is Trump won. And so having said that, there were a lot of people who might have preferred one of the other candidates and really kind of struggled with, but that my candidate didn't win and that's disappointing to me and that's fine. But from my perspective, we did have to help him with the transition, right? And so once the convention happens, at that point, like we're not in a primary anymore. And I think some people really kind of still thought we were, right? I mean, a lot of the, Bill Kristol and so forth, a lot of the never Trumpers who basically still think we're in the 2016 primary. But basically our view and the view of Senator DeMint and the Heritage leadership was, we need to do everything we can to help him. He is our nominee. And if he wins, we need to be able to help him to staff up his transition and to basically be successful. And so that's what we did. And it was a big part of my life during that period from, summer of 2016 through, January 20th.
So tell me what that was like. What was the phone call What did it mean to work on the Trump transition? It had its own phases. Tell me the play-by-play.
Yeah, so the transition, and there's a lot of talk now, but just a lot of groups are involved in trying to prepare for the next transition, and you have different phases that basically it goes through. The first phase, the kind of pre-convention transition, really is secret. Like there's nothing really public going on. And it's important that it be secret in that basically you don't want your campaign staff getting distracted and focused on a transition effort, right? That your focus needs to be on winning. But we had kind of just basically back channel conversations. I was at the Heritage Foundation. Rick Dearborn was working for the campaign. And we were talking, okay, but having real conversations, putting real pen to paper on how we would look at structuring what the post-convention transition would look like. Rick was essentially the person on the campaign that was essentially dispatched to work on this project. At the point at which that Trump became the nominee, Rick was still working on the campaign. They announced that the transition was going to be run by Chris Christie, who brought in his own people. I think that was a little bit of it created a bit of a hiccup, right? Because Christie was not a Trump loyalist, didn't really understand his philosophy, was not loyal to his agenda or his allies. Nor were the people that were running the transition. Some were, but basically his senior team were essentially Christie people, and so that created a little bit of a challenge. But our role, the movement, was to try and install as many people into. There's a physical office when you have after the transition. After the convention happens, there's going to be a physical office in DC in a GSA building where all of your sort of pre-election transition people are working. They're doing things like personnel vetting. They're preparing memoranda. They're all the types of things you would be doing to prepare for an administration, a new administration. You're doing that kind of thing, and so that was being run by Chris Christie. On election day, after Trump won, all the people from the campaign are now released to be involved in the transition. So you basically have an influx of new people. These are really your kind of inner circle Trump loyalists who had been previously working to win the election are now working on the transition. So you're getting an infusion of real talent to come in and start taking it to the next level. And so I hadn't really been working in the post-convention transition office. I was still working out of Heritage. Like you're going to have people working on transition who are in different, geographically in different places, and not everybody has to be in the physical office. Then, but the other thing that was interesting that happened after the 2016 election was that the transition broke into two pieces. So you had the DC office continued. They got a little more space and basically continued to have people working there doing some of these roles. But then a lot of the senior campaign leadership was basically the Trump campaign had been run out of Trump Tower. It was on the 14th floor of Trump Tower. It's actually, I think, like the fourth or fifth floor, but Trump in his real estate genius decided people like larger numbers when they're on the top floor. So he basically skips like 10 floors, which is hilarious. But yeah, so it was actually the floor, the 14th floor of Trump Tower had been the set of The Apprentice. That was where the boardroom was and all that other stuff. And so it was kind of a bizarre setup. It wasn't really your typical office setup. But that was where we had, so the day after Thanksgiving, they called me and said, can you go there to work out of this office, to work on personnel for domestic policy? And so basically lived there for about a month or so, month and a half.
Wow. What was that like?
It was fun. It was basically like working on a campaign or doing something where, you're just away from your family, just kind of like doing a full-time job. I mean, it was like, basically we were there all day until late at night, just working on this project. None of us are getting paid. We're just basically loving what we do. But it was really, it was very ragtag. You're kind of building the plane while you fly it. But basically we would prepare these like org charts and recommendations for different cabinet positions, and then assistant secretary, deputy secretary, that kind of thing, and then we would send them up to an executive committee that all the senior leadership from the Trump campaign, family members, and so forth. And then they would review all these memos and kind of make some play calls on who was going to take different jobs. And we had a team in DC that would feed names to us. And a lot of it was really, you would put a lot of reliance on endorsements, right? So basically on our sheets that we would present, it would say, okay, this recommendation has, Steve Bannon, Dave Bossie, Kellyanne Conway, and Jared Kushner. And then this person has, could be, any recommender, Newt Gingrich and Rick Dearborn and different people like that. So you would basically send that up, and then they would, I think a lot of emphasis in this process is going to be on endorsements. So for people who are trying to get positions in the administration, the more you can essentially get people to vouch for you, like, you're in this process. That's super important, right? Because we can't know everybody. You're in the personnel business. American Moment feeds people into the congressional staff all the time. The Hill office doesn't know these people, but they say American Moment does, so therefore they trust that. And so I think we live in a world where, to some extent, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? And so that's what I found on the transition ended up being very important.
Tell me, is that process mostly a kind of getting to a yes process, or were there endorsements that you would see and be like, red flag off the desk?
Some of it could have been that, yeah. But usually those kind of people, if it was somebody who was a red flag, they wouldn't make it. Right. On the we essentially the only people you would list on the sheet would have been people that were known Trump captains, people who were either people who are strong supporters of him during the campaign, people who were his friends, or people who were known ideological allies, and that we would value that basically the executive committee ultimately would value their endorsement.